Whereas the Declaration of Independence proposes the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they became codified in the Bill of Rights passed over a decade later. These amendments have guided our people for over 200 years, but they are open to interpretation. Take the 9th and 10th Amendments. These were instituted to limit the power of government. Powers are reserved to the states and the people. These are referred to as the states' rights clauses. However, these amendments are in contrast to an article in the Confederation, in the Constitution, that allows the federal government to monitor interstate commerce. For example, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in the 1850s, it required free states to return escaped slaves to southern slave states. Now, the northern states felt this violated their states' rights to pass anti-slavery legislation. The federal government felt it was needed to regulate interstate commerce. Years later, the southern states argued that the northern abolitionists were interfering with their states' rights to have slaves. So the states' rights argument was used on both sides of that issue, and the issue eventually was not settled in a court of law, but on the battlefield. But states' rights arguments are present in two contemporary issues as well. Some states have passed laws legalizing medical marijuana, yet the federal government says these laws violate state or federal drug law and have arrested doctors and cancer patients. Vermont has passed a law giving rights to same-sex couples. Other states are passing laws that they do not have to recognize these rights. These issues of states' rights versus interstate commerce, because marriage does have an economic benefit to it, there's a lot of arguments, pro and con. But when you hear these court cases get settled, you won't hear judges affirming the right to be high while homosexual. They will prefer to take refuge in the legalese of reserve clause and interstate commerce. Amendment 8 against cruel and unusual punishment has been cited in death penalty cases and in drug cases. And in drug cases, the government freely seizes the assets of suspects and sometimes don't even return these assets after the suspects have been cleared. And our jails have been crowded with nonviolent drug offenders. And since September 11th, the U.S. government has ignored many of the provisions in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. When people are said to get off of a crime on a technicality, those technicalities often are the Constitution of the United States. The ACLU reports, just 45 days after the September 11 attacks, with virtually no debate, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. Many parts of the sweeping legislation take away checks on law enforcement and threaten the very rights and freedoms that we are struggling to protect. For example, without warrant and without probable cause, the FBI now has power to access your most private medical records, your library records, and your student records, and can prevent anyone from telling you it was done. Normally, the government cannot effect a search without obtaining a warrant and showing probable cause to believe the person has committed or will commit a crime. Section 215 of the Patriot Act violates the Fourth Amendment by allowing the government to effect Fourth Amendment searches without warrant and without showing probable cause. For example, a survey conducted by the University of Illinois suggests that by December 2001, the FBI had already approached 85 out of some 1,500 libraries that the Patriot Act highlights. The government will no longer be required to disclose the identity of anyone, even an American citizen, detained in connection with a terror investigation until a criminal charge is filed. Now, in the amendment, they do have an out. I think it's in the one of those amendments. I can't read it right now. Though it says, in time of military crisis and at time of war, there's some leeway to suspend these things. But we have a hard time nowadays defining when a war begins and when one ends. The Iraq war is supposedly over, but yet they're killing us and we're killing them. It still seems like it's on to me. But even more insidious is the war on terrorism. Because how do you know when that is over? If there hasn't been an attack for 6 months, does that mean it's over? Or is it you're always at a chance that a terrorism act could happen anytime? Because they happen when you least suspect it. So we can never have an end to the war on terrorism because it always might happen. Terrorism is frightening. It frightens people of both parties. Bill Clinton expanded many of the wiretap procedures after the Oklahoma bombing. These laws make us feel safe. We want the government to catch the bad guys. But if we give them too wide of a net, we may find ourselves caught like so many dolphins headed for the tuna factory. At GA, one of the speakers was political columnist Wendy Kaminer, and she writes that out of the 1,200 people arrested after September 11, only 10 were believed to be connected directly to Al-Qaeda or the hijackers. About 18 people were suspected of having distant connections to either the hijackers or the other 10 suspicious detainees. In other words, the government seemed to have imprisoned about 1,170 people who were innocent of any connection to terrorism. British and Australian officials are complaining about their treatment of their citizens at Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. government is preventing access to lawyers and holding secret tribunals. They refuse to follow both the Geneva Convention or U.S. law. But the only amendment that our Justice Department appears to be interested in is the Second Amendment. While they are very concerned about monitoring terrorists' access to library books, they seem unconcerned about their access to guns. Second Amendment calls for a well-regulated militia for defense of the state, and they seem to advocate a non-regulated right to avoid surveillance by buying weapons at gun shows. The First Amendment states that Congress should make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Now, this did not prevent our Unitarian forebears from receiving Massachusetts taxes until the 1830s. As part of the established state congregational church, they had been receiving this money since colonial days. The Universalists were among those who sued and won their case in the Supreme Court. The president's faith-based initiative collides with this amendment. Similar proposals were promoted by both the Democratic nominees in the last election, so there seems to be bipartisan support for giving churches money to do social services previously done by the government or secular agencies. Soon after these were proposed, I found myself in the strange position of agreeing with Pat Robertson that this shouldn't happen. Now, my reasons for it not wanting it were somewhat different from his, but he realized that if the government is going to be funding religions, They might have to fund Hindus, people from Islam, Jews, and, heaven forbid, UUs. Now, the Supreme Court recently ruled that an Alabama judge that could not display the Ten Commandments in his courtroom. They held the line on this issue. The Alabama State's Attorney, Bill Pryor, supported the judge and has been quoted as saying, "God has chosen through his Son Jesus Christ this time, this place for all Christians, Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox to save our country and save our courts." On April 9, President George W. Bush nominated Pryor to be a lifetime spot on the 11th Court of Appeals. The First Amendment also defends the right of free speech, free press, and peaceable assembly. Many Americans exercise these rights in the protests of the war, and it would not surprise me if they are now on government lists of potential terrorists. Now, I'm not a lawyer or an expert on constitutional law, but it seems that there is a change afoot. To me, this is symbolized by the Flag Amendment. An amendment against burning the flag has been proposed every year for many years, and it's either been vetoed by the president or tabled in the Senate. But this year it might pass, and it would be signed by our president. And this would override the First Amendment protection of free speech. Which is more patriotic? To defend the flag or the Constitution? I think defending the Constitution is more important. The flag is a symbol of our freedom. The Constitution is our freedom. As Unitarian Universalists, we are in a unique position. We have been part of the expansion of human rights in this country. As a religious minority, we are likely to be passed over if the government starts handing out checks to churches. UUs love to speak out. We will be affected if that right is curtailed. Thomas Jefferson considered himself a Unitarian, and he wrote that we had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Without civil liberties, our lives will be curtailed and our pursuit of happiness diminished. We have to be vigilant and defend our freedom. We are a minority religion in this country, just like Islam and Judaism. We affirm the right of conscience and the democratic process. That means we want a voice in what happens to us. Democracy means majority rule, but more important to us is the right of conscience. That is what is endangered when majorities refuse to respect the rights of individuals. That's why the Constitution needed the Bill of Rights before the states would adopt it. I value the right of conscience. That is why, as a religious leader, I'll never tell any of you how to vote. To endorse candidates violates the separation of church and state. But churches are permitted to speak out on the issues of the day. I have informed you of only a few of the examples of the assaults on personal liberties, and I encourage you to look for more examples and resist them. Liberty is not easy, nor is it safe. Our search for safety will sometimes cause us to surrender our freedoms. Ultimately, I leave you with questions. Will we take our freedoms for granted? Or will we realize that they need to be reestablished in each generation? Are we brave enough to grant the freedom to others that we wish for ourselves? So often we think that the laws only apply to criminals and not us. But it is possible to write laws that would make any one of us a criminal. What freedoms do we cherish? What do we fear losing? What do we hope to preserve? What is our Declaration of Independence? What sacrifices are we willing to make? What chances are we willing to take? Each of us have a stake in making this country the land of the free. We must muster the courage to stand up for ourselves and others in order for this to be the home of the brave. I know you have opinions. Free speech, democracy, even to disagree. Let's go.
Well, I have one opinion. I was just thinking of something right at the end, and I would hope that our Christian brethren and sister would join with us and realize that, and put into effect Jesus' words, whatsoever you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do also unto me. Realize that that is a fundamental Christian concept that supports our Constitution.
About the definition of war when it ends, I've heard a lot of different terms dealing with war lately. You have, like you were talking about, the 10-year war, terrorism, and things that go on. You have the war on drugs. You know, it's not something that can be a treaty. You know, the terrorism thing happened. Preemptive war, which is what we did to Iraq, which, you know, we're building a new government. The Afghanistan thing, there is no clear-cut end anymore, so we're adapted.
I think that all of us are concerned, not about the people who are registered who don't vote, but about the people who don't even register to vote, which is probably a very, if you consider people registered who don't vote and people who don't register, they're the majority. And I think that to have a true democracy, we need to be concerned about why people don't register. And I believe, if they feel that they are not represented by either party, by the needs that they perceive that they have. And I think, to me, a true democracy, we need to be concerned about the needs which are not even stated by either party. And I hope that between now and the election, more people will find a way to communicate with the non-registered and the non-voters and find their needs and make them part of the issues that are the needs of election of people who represent everybody. Hope I was clear.
Yes.
Some of this reminds me of a discussion in the forum this morning. Let me add a couple of things. First of all, the reason we had the first 10 amendments, one big reason is because North Carolina refused to adopt the Constitution without the amendments being included. We were the #1 state that led the fight for these amendments. You people, you citizens of North Carolina, are the reason we have the first 10 amendments. Secondly, when you say you defend the flag, like we have the flag amendment where you defend the Constitution, I think what you really should say is, are you defending the flag, or are you defending one interpretation of the Constitution? Nowhere in that Constitution does it say anything about the flag. People have interpreted burning the flag as speech. There are many, many of us who disagree absolutely with that. When you burn the American flag, you're burning the symbol of our people, my ancestors, those of us who died to make sure this country is here. There were a couple other things too I want to comment on. I'm not sure I can read them here. You know that every European country subsidizes the churches. And they do that because nobody goes to church over there. As long as we can convince our people to go to churches, then we don't have to subsidize them. And I was speaking very low earlier. I wonder how much we get. Subsidize their church. More or less.
I think we should never lose track of the history that the people who wrote these amendments, who wrote the documents so dear to our country, had a great vision of what man can be and where man probably should set his sights to be. just think that probably that we do not, in our country now, with our different governments, have a vision of where we go. Lincoln saying, where there's no vision, people perish. And sometimes I feel that we are perishing. We are losing those aspirations, those goals, or ideas that we set out to accomplish in 1776. In his book on John Adams, David McCullough pointed out, he thought that the last president who had the common good of the people was John Adams. And after that, we fell down into partisan politics. I hope we can recover the vision that we have and we can progress toward and at least evolve toward those things that they had in mind for us to be doing.
And even John Adams' wife told him, don't forget the women.
You know, for forever, I've heard the saying that people who don't learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. And if you look back, we have a faction that's in power right now, or seems to have an awful lot of power that wants to empire better. So we find the excuse to invade Iran after we bomb every sand dune and mountain in Afghanistan. We've not established anything in either country, but they're talking about more. And yet we're watching our civil liberties crumble at the same time. This grab for power internationally and within the country bothers me.
The thing that worries me most about what's going on with the current reinterpretation of rights and liberties out of Washington is what they're trying to do in secret, particularly in the case of suspects held in connection with the vague and broad blanket terrorism. They're being held without access to attorneys, without being charged formally with any crimes, and refusing to release even names to the public. Anything that they have to do in public, abuses can be deterred. Anything that has to leave a formal paper trail, abuses can be deterred or corrected. Anything that can be done indefinitely, in secret, and without formal charges is open to a galaxy of abuse indefinitely.
I wanted to say is that I think there's also an enormous shadow side to the founding of our country that we really don't look at. And part of the shadow side is that a lot of what was formed was for the well-being of the wealthy. And it was very much about the pursuit of property against the needs of the many. And we don't look at that shadow. We don't, and the original wording was actually going to be life, liberty, and pursuit of property. James Madison talks specifically about protecting the rights of the wealthy against the righteous anger of those who do not own land. And we don't look at that. We also don't face that this country was founded in an inhabited land. There were other members of our species that lived here who had culture. And until we deal with some of the shadow pieces, we're going to continue to keep recreating.
I'm sure much of this conversation will continue in our coffee hour and hopefully throughout the rest of our lives. Please rise as you are able and join in singing hymn number 148, Let Freedom Span Both East and West.
And the both of us Finish our chalice with words from Dwight Eisenhower. Here in America, we are descended in blood and spirit from revolutionists and rebels, men and women who dare to dissent from accepted doctrine. As their heirs, may we never confuse honest dissent with disloyal subversion.